Well, good morning and welcome to another live video here from Concordia Technology Solutions. My name is Peter Frank and I'm the senior manager of our group. You've probably seen me on these before. I've been doing these on a weekly basis. Today we've got a very interesting topic for you. It's based on a blog post that I wrote about a year and a half ago, and the response that I've had from it has been very good. And so I thought I'd just do a video about that and bring some more information to the discussion. I'd love to hear your feedback, so if you're watching live, please comment below. If you're watching after the fact, you're welcome to put a comment. I'd be happy to respond. And later on today, I'll also post the link to the blog post so that you can check that out as well. So today our topic is the value of tracking church attendance and how to do it. Now we'll talk about this for about 20 minutes or so. I've got a few additional details I'd like to bring into the picture, but this started out as an interesting topic for me when I moved here to St. Louis. Now, in my home congregation, actually I've had a couple of home congregations, and we've always tracked attendance individually on cards that we would turn in during the offerings. It was a very similar way of doing it at the churches that I attended. And the last church I had attended before moving on to St. Louis, I'd been here for about 10 years, and it was just the standard practice. So when I moved to St. Louis and we started attending my in-laws' church, they did it a little bit different. They took attendance in a book rather than in cards. And that was a little different for me, but the same basic principles. And then when we landed our congregation that we're at today, it was the cards and the same thing. So it's always been standard practice to me that this is how you do it at church. You take individual attendance. Well, as I started working here at CPH and Concordia Technology Solutions and talking with different congregations, different customers, I found that wasn't always the case. And the more I talked to people, the more surprised I was that others are not taking individual attendance. Now, there's certainly many that are doing it, but the number who are not is very surprising to me because it's not part of my background. And conversely, the people I talk to who aren't taking individual attendance and haven't at their church in years are very surprised to hear that there are churches that are doing this. So I thought it'd be an interesting topic to kind of go through and explain why that is, because that is so often the question I hear from people who are not doing it. Well, why do you do this? And then if you can kind of convince them that there's value in it, then it's like, well, how are you even going to begin to do that? So that's what we're talking about today. So the first point of discussion is why take attendance at church? Now, there's several different kinds of attendance that we could take. And most churches, even those that don't take individual attendance, take total attendance, and usually it's just a head count. There's different ways of doing it. From what I hear most of the time, it's the ushers who are in the back that are taking the attendance. They're kind of doing a head count. They're marking it down. You'll see them kind of walking the aisles and counting silently to themselves. You've probably seen that at your church, and certainly at other churches if you've visited. That's not what we're talking about today. Head counts are very good, but they answer the first question of why you take attendance, and that is to see the health of the congregation. Now, we're going to talk about this as a number-based thing right now. We're going to move into the spiritual implications in a moment. So to take attendance will help you see the health of your congregation in a variety of different ways. First off, that top line number, when you're just doing a head count, will help you chart over time whether attendance is going down or going up, where you're at. Now, individual attendance, hearing or seeing exactly who is attended, will help you see the health of your congregation at a more defined level. So maybe one of your goals is to reach out to young families. Well, if you take just the top line number, you're not going to see if your church is reaching young families through worship attendance by that top number. You just don't get any other context other than that number. And so individual attendance tied in with the data that you know about them through your church management software, that helps you understand, are you reaching those targets? Are you reaching those demographic groups that you're hoping to reach? Even if you don't have goals assigned to that, that'll help you see, okay, well, 85% of those who attend worship are in their 80s. That means that my congregation is getting very old, and these numbers aren't going to stay this way for too long. So that helps you get a better understanding of the health of your congregation as a whole when you can see who is attending and how frequently. Now, even more importantly than that, it helps you see the spiritual health of your members, because worship attendance is part of the life of a Christian, that if they faithfully attend, they're being fed by God's body and blood, the body and blood in the Lord's Supper, being fed by God's word through the hearing of the gospel, the proclamation, and the sermon. That's such a core part of the Christian life that if people are not attending, they're missing out on that. Not to mention the fellowship of all believers that you receive when you attend a worship service. Many times people will say, well, I'll just listen to God's word. I'll stay in God's word that way. And that's good. You don't receive the physical gifts that are given in the sacraments. You don't receive that fellowship of the community of all believers. At the very least, you're hearing God's word. So that's good, but it doesn't talk about the whole picture of spiritual health. And that's where, as you track worship attendance, tracking it is not to the benefit of any member's spiritual health, but it'll allow you to identify those whose attendance is declining, those who are slowing down or stopping altogether, so that you then can follow up. And that's the important thing to think about as you're thinking about tracking attendance. The attendance itself is not meaningful without the personal interaction based on that information. So if you notice a person is no longer attending as faithfully as they were or at all, that's your signal to then go and talk to them and find out what's going on. There may be legitimate things that you can do to encourage them. There may be a reason they're not attending worship based on a miscommunication, or they're upset about something. Now, one of the counterpoints that I often hear is, well, I know my congregation very well. This often comes from pastors. I know who's here. I am preaching every Sunday. I can look out. I'm giving communion. I know who's coming and who's not coming, and so I can go and follow up with them. And for smaller congregations, that makes a lot of sense. If you have 20, 30, 40 people attending on a weekend, you're going to know who's there and who's not. That's easy to maintain. The larger congregations, or the mid-sized congregations, even those that have 100, 200 people, you may still be able to identify if somebody was there or not, but it's not going to be as easy to pick up on those exceptions. It's easy to remember who's there. It gets a little bit harder to remember who's not there. And so that's why I can encourage you, even if you are, one of those 50, 60 members a week congregations, that gets harder to remember who those exceptions are. You still have that same desire, that same follow-up to reach out to those who are not there. It's just harder to track. So that is the spiritual health, and it can go beyond that, but we're gonna leave that there because it ties into this next step as well. So spiritual health of members is an important reason why. The physical health of members is another reason. Now, this may seem odd. What does worship attendance have to do with the physical health of members? Well, if somebody has not attended worship recently, there's a reason for that. And if they are not one to share personal information, it may be that they are physically unable to attend worship and haven't told you about it. And I know in my personal experience on our board of elders and in talking with pastors, that'll happen a lot. There may be somebody, even if it's like a sprained ankle, nothing real serious, but preventing them from attending worship, that impacts their spiritual life. And so these physical ailments that you may not know about are impacting the spiritual health of your members. Tracking worship allows you to see that when the members are not willing to share that with you themselves. And I know for my family and for many others, we are not hesitant to let our church office know if there's something causing us to not attend worship, or if we need, a visit in the hospital, if there's surgery or something like that. For us, that's not anything too sensitive because we understand the implications. But many, many people will not tell their pastor or their church office when they're going to be in the hospital for the next 3 weeks recovering, or when they ended up from an emergency surgery. they don't want to bother the pastor. They don't think that they are important enough to justify him driving out to the hospital to pray with them. And I have yet to meet a pastor who doesn't want to do that for his members. And so tracking an individual attendance will give you that clue to go and talk with them and get a better understanding. Now, for some people, it may be the sign that they are now needing to move into the visitation schedule. Pastor may be very well in touch with them and see their physical needs or their physical health is declining, and know that one of these days they're going to be on the shut-in list rather than those who are attending worship. And the person may be in denial about that. They may think, okay, well, this is just a time. I'll get better and attend more regularly. And so I don't want to trouble Pastor with visiting me now because I will start attending worship again. This tracking individual attendance allows Pastor to make that call and say, okay, when you're ready to come back to worship regularly, that'll be great. But in the meantime, I'm going to bring communion to you. And so it kind of takes that weight off of the individual member to make that decision for themselves and allows the pastor to say, I want to do this for you. So those are a number of reasons why. I think those are the most important things. There is, as you start looking outside of just worship attendance and looking at Bible study attendance or fellowship attendance, you get some of those same things, but in a larger context too. Worship is certainly the most important. That is where the sacraments are received. That's a key part of physical or spiritual health, but there's more to it than that outside. So we're just going to focus on worship attendance right now. We won't get into Bible study attendance and all of that, although that fits into this picture as well. Okay, let's move on then to the question of how do I do this? And that's what I'll hear from larger congregations is how can I possibly track each person's attendance when I have 600 people attending, when I have 1,500, 2,000, you get into these larger churches, it becomes quite difficult. And I understand that, and this is not an easy task by any means. There is no way that anybody can look at 6,000 or 600 people and say, we're going to go ahead and just jot this down on my list and I'll fill that in later. I know it's a big task. And that's why the why becomes so important. Once you understand the why and the value that's gained, not every single check mark for attendance has spiritual implication. It's really the ones that aren't checked that have that, and you can't get those without checking all the boxes for the large number that's there. And so there's a number of ways to do that. If you've never done this at your congregation, or if you are doing it and you're finding it to be inefficient, hopefully these will give you a few different ideas. So the first one we're going to talk about is the attendance cards. The way that I know best, that my congregations have used, that's most familiar to me, and there is some challenges with this, but the way this works is that there are cards that are placed in the pews or by the seats if you don't have pews. Sometimes it'll be like under seat pockets, and I've also seen it where it might be a detachable thing on the bulletin where you just tear off the side and fill it out. But these cards will have things like name and contact information, email, phone number, maybe address. Ours has one side for members, one side for visitors, and so you get different options depending on who you are, and we'll ask different questions. So it gives you the members will fill this out and turn it in at some point during the service, usually during the offering. Sometimes with the offering, they'll just put it all on the plate. Sometimes they'll collect it separately. I know at my congregation, the elders come by after the ushers, like immediately after the ushers, and collect those. And that gives them the chance to not just have the cards, but to have that personal face-to-face interaction, as brief as it may be, but to be able to see who's there. And for us, it's good to see, okay, I don't recognize that person, so after the service, I'm going to make sure I go talk to them. So there's value there, too, in that process of taking attendance. So that's one way to do that. Some of the other benefits that you get for this is that you don't have to just put name and contact information on the card. You could put a spot for prayer request. We put a spot to mark if you're communing or not. We track communion separately from attendance, and so that feeds into communion, who's taking communion as a shut-in visit. It's a separate chart, if you will. So there's a lot of value to be gained by that. The challenge with that is, first off, the time. It does take members a few moments to fill that out. There's also an expense of having to buy those or have them custom made if you want custom questions on there. And that's just the reality of the situation. There's also the challenge, and I'll hear this quite frequently as well, not everybody fills that out. So if we're not getting everybody's information, then why are we doing it at all? And there's some merit to that. Bad information, bad data leads to bad trends, but I think that the number of people, in my experience, the number of people who don't fill it out is not enough to stop doing it. The value gained by those who are filling it out is important. And what I've seen in congregations is that the people who don't fill it out never fill it out. And so then you have to rely on those other methods of seeing them and talking with them to make sure that they're okay. But those that do fill it out faithfully. And so for those that are filling it out, you get the trends. And if you happen to see a family that their worship attendance in your database shows nothing, but you see them there every week, you kind of have that in the back of your mind. And really the alternative to taking attendance is not taking attendance, and so they're going to fall into that group anyways. So for those who do fill it out, it's valuable, and it's not that time consuming, especially when you compare that with the benefits that are gained. So that is one way of doing it. The other way, another way, is through the sign-in books. Now, I mentioned this before. That's how my in-laws' church does this, where in the pew, at the very end of the pew, there is a little tiny book. It's not the size of a full binder. It's about half of a binder size. And in there's sheets of paper, and everybody in the pew fills it out, passes it down. You have less opportunity to put information in there, but it's much more cost efficient because the paper is cheaper. It's not cardstock like you might get with an attendance card. And it's easy to pass that along and fill it out on one, and then at the end of the service, somebody goes and collects those and rips the pages out and uses that to enter into the database. The benefit of this is certainly cost. It's more cost effective than attendance cards. It's about the same amount of time for the members to fill this out, maybe a little less if there's fewer fields to complete. But it also doesn't take time during the service to collect that. And so you save time in the service, you make it more efficient. And there's a little bit more of an explanation of it sitting there and picking it up than having to explain how to fill out the card. So not a lot of time savings, but it's definitely there. And the end result is still the same, is that you get the information about who has attended. And so I really like that method because it's very non-invasive. You lose the value of that personal face-to-face of the elder or usher collecting those cards and seeing who's there, but you still gain that through taking communion as people come up, or as the usher dismisses people, depending on how your church does it. So you can get that in other ways, and that's why I put that number 2, because you lose that interaction to see who's there, who's potentially new, but all the other benefits are there. So that is another way of doing that, and that is very scalable. It works for large groups as well. All right, the third option that I'm going to share today is check-in stations. And often you'll hear about check-in as it's tied in with children's ministry. And that's a very common way of using check-in station for security purposes. If you're dropping a child off, you fill out the form, put all the emergency contact information it'll spit out barcodes, you put it on the kids, and then when you go to pick them up, there's that security point of, well, let's make sure everything matches. That's not what we're talking about, that kind of child check-in. This is attendance check-in, where you'd have some sort of kiosk by the doors to your sanctuary, where people can go and mark their attendance. And it could be a touch screen, it can be really quick. You get the benefit of it not taking up time during service. You get the benefit of asking, really ultimately an unlimited number of questions, although you want to be careful. You don't want people filling out 20 questions every time they come to church. But you also have the time savings of that going directly into your database. And there's some benefits with that too. Now, the downsides to doing it this way is that you will get a smaller percentage of people who will fill that out, who will take the time. And then if there's a line, if you put too many questions in there, it takes too long to fill that out. it's going to be you're going to get people who just walk right past it. And so you have to go into that with the assumption that not everybody is going to fill that out. So that's a downside. Another downside is that if you have older members, they might be unwilling to use that kind of technology. And that happens too. I wouldn't worry too much about that if you have a younger congregation. The younger people are not too afraid to use it. It's just like going up to an ATM, honestly. But that leads to the second point, is that it could serve dual purposes. You could put electronic giving at the same time as taking attendance. Put it all in that one kiosk. Make it a one-stop shop, and you may want multiple kiosks to do that. So that's another way of doing it. What I find is that many churches don't have the either the funds to pay for that equipment, or have the setup in their congregation to do it in a good manner. Otherwise, it's more off to the side, and then people don't fill that out. So that's good for some events. For some churches, that's a good way of doing that. It's not my recommendation, but there's certainly some advantages from a time perspective on the church office. If you are having a couple thousand people attending, entering that in by hand is really tough. So that's another option. It's not as far-fetched as this last option that I'm going to present, and that is facial recognition. This is something that is going to become more prominent in day-to-day life, that you will go places and it'll recognize you. You see this in all the sci-fi movies with retina scanning and that. There is software out there. It's not connected with CTS at all. There's software out there for facial recognition where it'll take a picture of your congregation and look at every face and then apply it and say, okay, so-and-so is here. And facial recognition is getting very strong and constantly improving. If you're on social media, on Facebook, Facebook will recommend, do you want to tag Peter in this photo if there's a picture of me? And, more than 9 times out of 10, it's correct that that's me. There's been a few times I've seen where it'll show a picture of my son and want to tag me in there because we look sort of similar. It'll recognize the eyes. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. Now, the downside to this is it's a little weird. It's a little creepy to have facial recognition at the church. And like I said, we're not connected with the one company I know that does this. But I'm curious to see where this goes. I can't imagine any situation where the pastor will be up there taking a photo and saying, okay, everybody, we're going to take attendance. Make sure you can see the lens. That's not going to happen, or at least I hope it doesn't. I could see something where coming in the entrance, there's something, you already have cameras for security purposes, just use that to take people's attendance. I find this to be a little bit intrusive, and for some people, they don't want their attendance or their photo taken. They don't want their attendance taken, much less having their photo taken. It's going to make people uncomfortable. But depending on the culture of your church, it may work. From a practical standpoint, I think it'd be very difficult to build up that database of photographs and keep it up to date. But the idea is kind of cool, and if you're a very tech-savvy congregation, I could see some benefits to that. So that's my far-fetched idea for the day of taking attendance. So there are other options that are coming down the pike, people we've talked to who have software that allow you to check in on your phone. That's kind of exciting. I could see see that being used. I know that the technology barrier at the member level will make any technology solution difficult, because you are going to have people who are always having their smartphones with them and are ready to do that, and you're going to have people who will never touch a cell phone their entire life because they're just not comfortable with that technology. And so there's no perfect method of doing it, but I think you'll get more and more options available as things come. And the great thing about this is the church doesn't have to be the one setting the tone. The technology that's going to be used for this will be used in many other industries, retail industries, GPS pointing who's there, if you make your phone available to track that and tell people where you are. Things like Foursquare and all that have been around for a while now and could be implemented in that. So all of that is a little bit probably beyond where most churches are comfortable with today. And that's why I recommend those traditional models of filling out the cards or filling out the books and entering that in. So that's the discussion for today. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you've got a different way of doing it, if you've got an idea that you've never seen before and you wonder how it'll work, or if you are just completely opposed to the idea and I didn't explain a reason why, I'd love to hear that too. So please go ahead and put a comment in the chat below, or send me an email and let me know, peter.frank@cph.org. So thank you very much for joining me today. We'll be back next week with another discussion. I appreciate you spending a little bit of your time talking about technology in the church. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.